They began as a slave, nameless and powerless, chained to obscurity in the Sith Empire. Yet through cunning, hunger, and a mastery of forbidden knowledge, they rose to seize the title of Dark Lord. This was no ordinary Sith. This was Darth Nox, a sorcerer who bound the spirits of the dead, a survivor who clawed their way through betrayal and war, and a figure who bent the Force itself into submission. To speak of Nox is to enter a chamber of echoes, where tombs whisper, ancient names stir, and the living bargain with the long silent. What follows is the fullest telling of that path, from bondage and dust to a throne among the Dark Council, from a mortal body to a vessel for powers that refuse to die. Before Nox was a name that inspired dread. There was only a number, only the indifferent chain of labor that fed the Sith war machine. The Empire ran on mines and manufactories, on worlds bled dry, and on the unseen millions whose lives began and ended in service. In such places, identity becomes a luxury, desire a hazard, and hope a kind of treason. Yet even there the Force pays attention. It finds the stubborn spark in the ash heap and keeps it smoldering. When Korriban called, when the recruiters and the cruel-eyed overseers trawled for any trace of ability, this nameless slave was plucked out of obscurity and thrown into a crucible that never stops killing the unworthy. Korriban is less a planet than a memory made of stone. It is a landscape of tombs and thorned ridges, where the sand itself seems to carry a charge of malice. There the Sith teach two truths that shape every acolyte's life. The past is a weapon if you know how to wield it, and survival is the only virtue that matters. The Academy's corridors are narrow on purpose, leading rivals to brush shoulders, spar, and bleed. Statues of ancient lords watch with blank contempt as new aspirants fail their first lesson and become footnotes. It is not that the Sith hate the weak, it is that weakness has no narrative power in this place, and therefore no right to continue. In that forge, the slave endured. What others mistook for meekness was a quiet appetite for knowledge. When more brash acolytes rushed to prove themselves with displays of ferocity, this student listened, watched, catalogued, and chose to survive. They came to understand that anger is a blade that dulls quickly, while insight stays sharp. They studied the tombs and the ritual texts, the anatomies of old sorceries buried behind warnings and ritual scrawl. They learned the names of those who had gone further than mere fury. Tulak Horde, who mapped domination like a cartographer. Ajunta Paul, whose melancholy haunted his relics. Mark Aragnos, who codified power without apology. From these shades, the acolyte absorbed a more patient grammar of ambition. The Academy's trials are a theology of elimination. Each assignment is designed to force the acolyte into an impossible choice. Betray a friend or accept failure. Transgress a taboo or forever fall behind. The slave-turned-student understood that the trials were not obstacles, but invitations to declare a worldview. They declared that knowledge is more reliable than bravado, that secrets outlast flesh, and that the past properly consulted will finance the future. Where others hoarded blade techniques and flashy telekinetics, this acolyte hoarded methods: how to get a tomb door to listen, how to coax a shard of memory out of a funerary mask, how to persuade an inscription to give up its true tense. They learned to talk to walls and received answers. They learned to make questions do harm. It was inevitable that a true Sith would take notice. A patron arrived in the shape of a smiling master whose promises were as precise as the plots simmering behind them. Sith mentorship is a transaction drawn in blood. The master feeds the student techniques and opportunities, and the student feeds the master results and, when the time is ripe, feeds them something else entirely. Under that tutelage, the acolyte accelerated. Missions that would have been terminal for others became case studies in leverage. An unarmed expedition into a sealed catacomb yielded a ritual schema thought to be lost. A duel arranged to rid the Academy of a promising competitor ended not with a corpse on the floor, but with the rival indebted, redirected, useful. Around this time, the first betrayals began to clarify the air. Promises that seemed generous revealed their price, and the price was identity. The master coveted not only the students' successes but the very architecture of their will. In the Sith tongue, this is called inheritance, and it is rarely metaphorical. Rituals exist to move more than titles from one person to another. Bodies can be treated as containers. The acolytes sensed this long before the final ceremony and began to prepare a response that was half counter-ritual, half act of faith in their own stubbornness. The lesson was not simply that trust is foolish. The lesson was that trust must be engineered to explode into benefit when it inevitably fails. By the time the Academy acknowledged the acolyte as worthy and released them into the wider machine of the Empire, something had changed in their bearing. They had learned how to be underestimated without being small, how to hide in plain sight without being absent, and how to let the Force's currents press against them without being moved by anything but choice. They had also learned to read the Empire as one reads a palimpsest, governments written over with the ghostly ink of older empires, military orders layered on ancient cultic maps, practical logistics traced with a finger dipped in superstition. To thrive in such a place requires not only ruthlessness but translation. On the world that housed the Empire's political heart, where thunder rolled and cities wept constant rain, the newly emancipated Sith turned toward investigation of the dead. This was not morbid indulgence. It was a strategic wager. The oldest powers in the galaxy do not die so much as change a dress. Behind every visible battle line exists an invisible contest to control meaning, tradition, and the terms of inheritance. The Sith call this the sphere of ancient knowledge, and it is both a bureau and a theology. To hold its documents is to possess signatures that alter what is possible. The first spirit arrived not through accident but by design. In a tomb, long thought exhausted, the Sith sought more than relics and found a presence that did not accept being described in the past tense. The dead lord did not love the living intruder, but they respected the grammar of questions asked correctly. Boundaries were negotiated, ritual space defined, and the first bond was forged, a pact between a living will and a disembodied intellect that had forgotten how to accept finality. The experience was both intoxicating and terrifying. To host another's hunger is to feel your own intensify and blur. To borrow another's memory is to risk editing your own. The Sith took the risk and discovered a principle that would define their ascent. If you can carry one voice, you can carry more. From that moment, the Sith began to gather the dead as others gather soldiers. Each binding was a little different. Some spirits were lashed into obedience by oaths older than any city. Others were persuaded by the promise of relevance, by the offer to see their ambitions completed in a body that could still exert force. Still others were tricked, for deception remains a form of respect when dealing with those who once played the same game. The rituals left marks. The living host's veins ran colder after each success. Their eyes learned to focus on two different epochs at once. In quiet corridors, murals seemed to shiver when they walked by, as if paint too knew the shock of extension beyond intended years. The toll could not be ignored. The body is not built to house a chorus. At night the host woke with their heart beating in two rhythms that did not agree. During negotiations, their gaze drifted to exits no one else could see, sight lines into structures no one else had explored. There were moments when the dead tried to pilot the living like a hilted weapon. But the Sith had learned the sovereignty that comes from attention. They developed internal architecture, a way to seat their guests and insist on an order of speech. They discovered that the Force rewards those who refuse to be passengers, even to their own thoughts. They learned to be a captain in a storm of voices and, when necessary, a tyrant. Inevitably, attention from above became hostile. One member of the Dark Council, the body that arranges the Empire's appetites into policy, had made a career of guarding tradition against innovation masquerading as heresy. This elder lord saw in the young sorcerer not a promising vanguard, but a violation. Their ideological clash had personal roots. The elder believed that power should be succession, not revolution. The younger believed that succession is only respectable when it is earned. Their first confrontation did not occur in the secrecy of a tomb, but in a hall where echoes magnify humiliation. The elder struck with rituals framed as judgments. The younger endured and survived. And from that moment, the conflict became doctrine with a face. The contest between them ripened into a ritual of its own, an old Sith form of vendetta that conscripts allies and transforms entire planets into arenas. The elder lord invoked it to make destruction legal. The younger accepted because they had learned that the law of the Sith is a script that rewards improvisers. Battles emerge not just as physical clashes, but as competing narratives. Who could turn a planet's memory against the other? Who could inherit the loyalty of ancient cults? Who could convince the Empire's bureaucracy that their version of continuity was less dangerous? The sorcerer who carried the dead proved to be a gifted choreographer of logistics. Fleets arrived like arguments. Armies advanced along the lines laid down by old sigils traced on the ground. Their companions played roles in this rising symphony. An assassin born of a species that feasts on the Force moved always at the Sith's side, hungry and wry, a living reminder that power can be devoured as well as wielded. Agents of intelligence, soldiers of convenience, allies of principle and of profit, found themselves circling a gravity well of intent. To follow Nox, as the whispered name finally began to congeal, was to be drafted into a campaign that rewrote what counted as victory. They did not conquer for territory alone. They conquered for access to archives, for permission slips to approach ceremonies forbidden even to the faithful, for machines whose architecture was itself a form of prayer. The web of spirits within Nox deepened and frayed. Some of the bound lords bristled at sharing their new host. Others entered into temporary alliances, their centuries-old feuds briefly suspended when a moment's coordination could turn a duel. The living discovered the discipline of consultation. Before a ritual, they would go quiet and listen for the pressure points the dead had learned in their own eras. The price of such counsel was constant vigilance. The line between remembering and being remembered blurred. In their private meditations, Nox began to visit places they had never been, to grieve for wars they had not fought, to feel the tenderness of victories that were not their own. It is the paradox of necromancy that empathy increases with each trespass. To carry the dead is to learn why they mattered to themselves. When the feud with the Elder Lord reached its legal crescendo, the arena shifted to a world whose streets had learned to absorb bootfall without echo. There the duel took shape as both a spectacle and a judgment. The Elder hurled lightning drawn not just from their hands but from the prestige of their years. Nox answered with a lattice of power woven from the voices they carried, spells layered atop memories, and the air itself bent under the weight of competing claims to continuity. The end, inevitably, was not a mere defeat, but a conversion. The Elder, undone by a method they refused to respect, became a cautionary legend. Nox, vindicated, took possession not only of their rival's seat, but of their responsibilities, inheriting an entire sphere of the Empire's power. To sit on the Dark Council is to become a different creature. The vantage grows higher and lonelier. The currency shifts from victories counted in bodies to victories counted in generations. Nox evolved accordingly. They did not shed the hunger that had defined their rise. They learned to dress it in patience, to make it speak in policy, to give it schedules and budgets. The sphere of ancient knowledge is a government as much as an archive, and Nox tuned it toward a specific purpose: to make the Empire's memory dangerous. They funded excavations that looked like charities and were, in fact, arsenals. They trained researchers to think like infiltrators and infiltrators to think like historians. They wrote doctrines that pretended to be mere cataloging and were instead blueprints for leverage against both enemies and allies. War with the Republic threaded through this period like a recurring fever. Nox's influence on the war was more architectural than tactical. Where generals maneuvered battalions, they maneuvered myths. On one front, a campaign reactivated a long-dormant superweapon whose true engine was a ritual lattice older than either faction. On another, a world's native priesthood was persuaded to interpret ancient prophecies in ways that harmonized with imperial logistics. Nox's methods unsettled even their friends. For all the Sith celebrate innovation when it destroys a rival, they remain suspicious of methods that do not flatter their own preferences. Yet results have their own rhetoric, and Nox's results were undeniable. In places where the Republic relied on transparency, they encountered mirrors darkened by design. In places where the Empire's brute force would have been counterproductive, the past was laid out like stepping stones across a marsh, and Imperial walkers crossed dry-shod. The danger of Nox's strategy was cumulative. Each success justified the next binding, the next ritual that extended the House of the Self to encompass yet another tenant. When a series of seizures threatened to collapse that house entirely, counsel arrived from an unexpected quarter. A culture known for its reverence toward balance rather than domination offered a healing, not of exorcism, but of arrangement. The living would not be purged of their passengers. Rather, they would learn to seat them so that each voice no longer shredded the others. In a chamber bathed in light that seemed to radiate from the stone itself, Nox endured a treatment that was half therapy, half geometry. The interior storm quieted. The dead no longer demanded the helm, and their host remembered the shape of singular pronouns without apology. This interlude did not soften Nox's purpose. It clarified it. Having survived the hazards of their chosen path, they began to speak more openly in the idiom of memos, directives, and subtle speeches about what it means to master death without pretending to defeat it. They argued that the Sith obsession with legacy often masks a fear of mortality so profound it blinds the Order to opportunities more interesting than simple survival. If one can bind a voice without becoming a puppet, one can also bind a lesson without becoming predictable. The Sith have always taught that passion breaks chains. Nox added a footnote. Passion, disciplined by memory, forges new and more useful chains. Not all within the Empire applauded. Some saw in Nox's rise a correction to complacency. Others saw only a blueprint for tyranny, too elegant to notice until it was everywhere. The Dark Council is a choir of soloists, and harmony is an accident. The pressures of war and the temptations of peace each sharpen the appetite for internal purges. Nox navigated the currents with the skill of one who had learned to listen before speaking. They were not above quiet assassination when necessary, but they preferred embarrassments that unfolded like old stories retold at the wrong moment, ruining a rival's timing and making their ambitions seem derivative. Comparisons to other Sith were unavoidable. To the warrior who burned worlds with the confidence of a battering ram, Nox offered the image of a locksmith who opens a door by persuading the tumblers to recall their maker. To the imperial mastermind, whose strings made even enemies dance, Nox offered a different theater, where the dead are not puppets but chorus, and the living are forced to hear history harmonize with the present. Where others declared that power is a singular narrative with a singular author, Nox built anthologies and acquired the rights. In a pantheon of lords who weaponized fear, Nox specialized in weaponizing relevance. It is difficult to terrify a foe who does not respect your methods. It is easier to make them obsolete. Outside observers, watching through the fog of propaganda and the distortions of distance, reached for analogies. Anthropologists whispered about shamanic traditions, in which a healer carries a host of borrowed spirits while remaining emphatically themselves. Historians cited tales of sorcerer kings who built empires atop the bones of their ancestors and insisted that the walls remember how the city was won. Philosophers speculated that Nox had redefined the Sith relationship to time, turning the past from an anchor into an accelerant. The most devout critics insisted that Nox had blasphemed by refusing to let the dead remain dead. The most devout admirers insisted that Nox had fulfilled the Order's darkest promise by making even death serve. The wars shifted, as wars do, when unexpected empires rose from directions no map had prepared for. In the turbulence that followed, some records placed Nox at the center of events, captured and later unleashed, adapting their sorcery to a new architecture of threat. Other records insist that Nox retreated from the stage, preferring the deep work of apprenticeship and archive building while the galaxy shattered and reassembled. The truth may never be a single line. Power of this sort breeds both legends and decoys. A dark counselor who survives betrayal and binds the dead learns to be generous with red herrings. There is self-preservation in dispersal. There is also delight. What can be said with certainty is that Nox's legacy operates on several frequencies at once. In ritual circles, their innovations have become templates carefully anonymized, widely imitated, often misunderstood. In the academy, their philosophy circulates as rumor and parable. Young acolytes are told the story of a slave who treated the past like a vault to be cracked, and found inside both treasure and the instructions for forging more vaults. In the military, officers who never once set foot in a tomb execute maneuvers whose logic follows lines drawn by Nox's priorities. They may not know the name behind the doctrine. Names matter less than habits. The question that haunts any figure who dared to treat death as a negotiable term is simple. Did it last? Did Nox finally pay the bill every sorcerer must pay? Or did they, through some final act of arrangement, become the kind of absence that structures presence? The most sober answer is that the galaxy contains many ways to persist. A voice can be preserved without the weight of a ghost. A method can host itself in the minds of those who practice it, becoming a kind of immortal rhythm. An archive can be engineered to awaken only when a certain question is asked. In this sense, Nox's endurance may be less theatrical than practical. Their survival lives in the way certain doors open more easily for those who speak to them, in how certain artifacts surrender their stories without the usual price, in how the concept of binding has escaped the margins of forbidden texts and entered the workflow of the Empire. To understand why Nox matters, one must return to the beginning and look again at the problem of slavery. A slave is taught that their value lies in the tasks performed for others. A Sith is taught that their value lies in the will imposed upon others. Nox's biography suggests a third option: value as the ability to alter the very grammar by which value is decided. Where a slave endures minutes and a lord hoards years, Nox acquired centuries by adoption. Where a slave's name is withheld and a lord's name is shouted, Nox's names became plural, a library inside a single chest. This is not freedom as most define it, but it is one of the few kinds of freedom that the Sith respect. Freedom from being compelled to measure yourself by someone else's calendar. There is, of course, a moral ledger that runs alongside such a life. To bind a spirit is to deny someone else's idea of an ending. To keep using the dead is to risk forgetting that the living require endings to give shape to their love, their grief, and their courage. Nox's defenders will say that the spirits they carried were not innocents dragged from rest, but lords who had already made covenants with ambition beyond compassion. Nox's critics will say that if you can do it, you will eventually do it to the wrong person. The debate is not easily resolved, which is another reason Nox endures. The most potent legacies are those that continue to demand judgment without offering easy absolution. What then of the figure themselves, stripped of theater, placed in a simple room with their own thoughts? The image that returns, culled from testimonies reliable and otherwise, is of a presence more quiet than its reputation, and more attentive than its enemies understood. Nox listened to opponents with the same care they applied to inscriptions carved by hands dead for 1,000 years. They did not rush to fill silence. They let it bloom into data. They were capable of sudden, horrifying violence, but their favorite victories occurred without a visible blow. When a rival arrived at a council session, convinced of the solidity of their position, and departed, convinced of a different solidity, whose architecture they could not recall assembling, Nox considered the day well spent. By now the outline of the life is clear. A slave enters the academy and refuses to let it define the terms of survival. An acolyte graduates into a practitioner who collects the dead as mentors, batteries, and sometimes as mirrors. A feud clarifies into a throne, and the throne becomes a desk piled high with programs whose true targets are years yet unborn. Wars come and go like weather, while doctrines deepen into climate. The figure we call Darth Nox sits at the intersection of several streams: knowledge as a weapon, memory as a commodity, death as a resource that refuses to remain silent when properly addressed. In the wider lore of the Sith, that intersection resembles certain archetypes that older civilizations knew by other names. There are the necromancers of antiquity, whose kingdoms survived not on armies alone, but on the continuity of counsel. There are the shamans, for whom selfhood is a federation, not a monarchy. There are sorcerer kings who claim descent from heroes not because genealogy demanded it, but because emulation is itself a family tree. Nox borrows from each without belonging to any. They are not a priest pretending to be a general, or a general moonlighting as a scholar. They are the solution to a question the Sith do not ask often enough. How do you make the past answer you without lying? Consider, finally, the simplest scene. A lone figure stands once more in a tomb on Korriban. The air is as thin and sharp as ever. Statues continue to indulge their scorn. Dust lies where it has always lain, rearranged only by the lightest breath. The figure speaks a name. The name answers. It does not matter whose. The method matters. The attitude matters. The quiet refusal to pretend that time can be bullied matters. Power, like sand, cannot be gripped tighter without escaping the hand. But power can be cupped, cradled, negotiated with, and persuaded to hold still long enough to be shaped. In that gesture lives the essence of Darth Nox's practice. There are stories that end with coronations and stories that end with funerals. This one refuses either clean closure. It ends, if it must end at all, with a corridor. On one wall, frescoes of victories that have already faded and will soon be repainted by new, clever hands. On the other, a sequence of doors, some sealed, some ajar, some waiting for someone to remember the right greeting. In the middle walks a sovereign of the in-between, a master of arrangements, a collector of echoes who refuses to be either volume or silence. From slave to counselor, from namelessness to a name that is many, from a single heartbeat to a chorus conducted rather than obeyed, Darth Nox moves forward. The light behind them is the light of a star sinking over red sand. The light ahead is the glow of instruments, of maps, of pages, of screens. And somewhere, always, a voice asks if they remember. They do. They always do. They remember because they made remembering into a weapon, and because they learned to be remembered without insisting on a statue. Some will come to this story seeking a recipe. They will ask how many spirits are safe to carry, which ruins yield the best weapons, which rivals are ripe for public defeat, and which for private erasure. The answer they deserve is disappointing and true. Nothing is safe to carry. Ruins give what they want to whom they want. Rivals are ripest when you stop needing the victory to be obvious. What can be taught is the posture. Listen longer than your hunger demands. Ask the question that mobilizes the room. Prepare for every pact to betray you, and design your response so that the betrayal grows your reach. Measure the cost in years rather than in headlines. Pay attention to the names that still draw breath when spoken. This posture will not make you Darth Nox. It will make you less likely to be food for those who become such things. There is a final rumor that refuses to die. It claims that when Nox at last confronted the limit of the body, they walked into a chamber where the air was a mixture of warmth and stone, and spoke not to a ghost, but to an idea. The idea asked a question that only they could answer, because only they had both defied and curated mortality. The answer was neither yes nor no, but a design. Perhaps that is why their presence can still be felt in places that never knew their footsteps. Perhaps that is why certain sentences in certain archives maintain a readiness, as if they were waiting for a familiar cadence to awaken them. If so, then this story will continue to lengthen its shadow, because stories that learn how to remain useful outlive those that merely burn bright. The galaxy forgets quickly. Empires collapse into footnotes between elections of new empires, and heroes collapse into anecdotes between the births of new scandals. But every so often, a life occurs that expands the definition of what it means to participate in time. Darth Nox belongs to that rare category. They did not just win and lose, command and obey, live and die. They rearranged the furniture of the possible. They made the dead take notes. They convinced the present to speak in the tense of the upcoming. And they showed that the most radical act a Sith can perform is not to shout louder, but to change which echoes are available to be heard. If you listen now, if you actually patiently listen, you will hear it. The faintest susurrus beneath the louder tales of conquest and defeat. It is the sound of a door learning your name. It is the memory of a grave deciding to open as if it had been waiting, politely, for you to arrive. So we conclude where the story began, with the paradox of a slave becoming a lord, by refusing the ordinary path between those two poles. The Empire supplied the pressure, Korriban supplied the crucible, the dead supplied their stubbornness, and Nox supplied the arrangement. Whether they still walk visible corridors, or have become the very pattern by which corridors acquire meaning is, in the end, a detail. The lasting lesson is simpler. The Force does not merely reward strength, it rewards attention. Darth Nox paid attention to what everyone else had relegated to the museum and turned it into artillery. They treated every archive as a barracks and every tomb as a classroom. In doing so, they rewrote the etiquette of power. That etiquette is out there now, in the field, in the schools, in the minds of those who will decide which old names will next be taught to answer when called. And if one of those names is Nox, it will be because this story was less a biography than a calibration of the ear, teaching you what to listen for when the stone begins to speak.